Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is John Fiesler. I'm the Executive Director of the Tourism Council of Frederick County, and happy to be one of the members of the Downtown Hotel and Conference Center Advisory Committee, working with a number of colleagues. I see Kara Norman here, Executive Director of the Downtown Frederick Partnership, Richard Griffin, Director of Economic Development for the City of Frederick. We're also working with the Chamber of Commerce. They're doing a business card exchange at this moment. The County Economic Development Department, and they're at the MACO convention, but certainly a lot of folks involved in this initiative, which, as you know, if you've been following it, has many, many aspects to it. So typically when any of us is talking about this project, we can never go very deeply into any one aspect, even though there are folks that may be particularly interested in learning more about different aspects. So we are delighted to have you here this evening as we have the opportunity to do a little bit of a deeper dive on the preservation, the historic preservation components of this project right across the creek from where we're sitting tonight. And so I'll do a couple of quick housekeeping announcements, kind of spell out the format, and then turn it over to our expert panel that will be doing presentations, and then we'll be doing a question and answer session at the end. So first, if you haven't already taken note, we do have some bottles of water in the back of the room. The restrooms are on the lower level here at the Delaplane Arts Center. You will see that on your tables, not only do we have notepads and pens, but we have index cards as well. The way we're going to handle the question and answer session is to please go ahead and write down questions so that we can go through all of our presentations. If a question occurs to you in the middle of one of those, go ahead and write it down. We have folks that will come around and collect those questions from you, and then when we're all done with the formal presentations, we'll go into those. So again, you don't need to wait. As soon as a question occurs to you during any of their presentations, go ahead and capture that, and we'll collect those and move on to that. Again, we do ask that those questions be focused on the subject tonight, since our panel here are focused on the historic preservation aspects of the project, that we do address questions on that subject. So I think that's it for the format and housekeeping information. So without further ado, we'll jump in, and I'll tell you who we'll be hearing from, and they'll be introducing each other as we go. But Donald Can and Mimi Giguere from Can Partners, the preservation folks that are working on this project, the Downtown Hotel and Conference Center project team, as well as Dr. Michelle Kearns, who is the project team's archaeologist. And they'll be providing a summary of the preservation-related information gathered to date, because this is an ongoing effort, and sharing that with you. Again, capture questions and just hold the card up when you're done. With that, I'll turn it over to Donald Can.
Good evening. We really appreciate the opportunity to come out tonight and discuss and present some of our findings, our current research, and certainly at the end welcome your questions. As some of you may know, and certainly there's some familiar faces, we've had several meetings with the Historic Preservation Commission, presented sort of a sequence of events that we've been going through, and we're certainly aware, all right, thank you, and we're certainly aware of the public interest in this project, and we want to be responding to that tonight around the preservation issues that have been raised. There are three parts of our presentation tonight. Mimi will talk at length about the Birely Tannery and our research and findings about the tannery. There have been a number of questions raised about the archaeology issues surrounding this site. Michelle is here, she will address that. And then finally, I'll come back and talk about the Frederick Railway Terminal. So we'll try to hit all of, at least as we see it, the major parts of the project. By way of a little bit of background, just quickly, Can Partners, our firm, was established in 1974 and have committed over many years now a great deal of our efforts toward historic preservation projects throughout the region, really. It's included adaptive reuse. In Frederick, when your city hall was converted from the courthouse, we were involved in that. We've worked at the Frederick Historical Society, and we're currently working on the Hessian Barracks restoration on the campus of the School for the Deaf, as well as many other projects throughout the state. Personally, I served as chairman of the Baltimore City Preservation Commission. I was on that commission for really most of 25 years. and been on many boards throughout the state. Our firm's received numerous awards for our work, but behind all that, we're really committed to a strong preservation ethic and sound and defensible preservation strategies. So just a quick background of where we're coming from. And from the beginning, I think in Frederick, like many cities, one of the real challenges of the city is to sort of balance the goals of historic preservation against the growth and development of downtown districts and make those districts vibrant, make those districts sustainable. And that's always a difficult balance. There are always both sides of those stories. And we try to find our best way through that, of course. And in order to further understand that or inform that analysis, you have to really look at each resource on the basis of clear preservation interests, clarity of what preservation treatment might be appropriate, and implement appropriate mitigation strategies where that's necessary. So we really hope that you understand as we go through this, we're trying to balance a number of issues that are certainly come together on a project of this scale. We were first contacted by the development team really almost 3 years ago in the fall of 2013 when we first met the Plamundons and the rest of the development team. And it was really at the beginning of their effort and thoughts about whether or not to pursue this project, particularly on this site. And it was really prior to any design decisions that were being made. That's when we were first involved. And our focus of that assignment, and as you'll hear tonight, was to assist the team in assessing the condition of the existing buildings and to establish parameters for either keeping or removing the structures as part of the development, and to assist in evaluating alternative redevelopment or adaptive reuse schemes where that might be appropriate. Our single focus has been from the beginning and continues to be focused on the existing buildings on the site and the issues around those buildings and the history of those buildings. We have documented that at great length, as you'll hear. So I'll stop now with that sort of context, hopefully. Mimi will begin our discussion with the Tannery.
I'm going to lower that because my best guess is that it probably wouldn't work up here for me. So good evening. Pleased to see a pretty good room full of folks. I want to start with the context of the property as a whole, and to some extent the Tannery and what's left of the Tannery complex in particular. But before I go there, and I know there's a lot of folks in the room that have some preservation understanding, but for those who may not, I want to define a bunch of geeky terms that I'm going to use. These are preservation geek terms. So I'll talk about Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties. That is a database of documents that are maintained by our State Historic Preservation Office, the Maryland Historical Trust. You'll hear me talk about MHT also. And they maintain a database of information on various historic structures all over the state of Maryland. And that is known as the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties. We'll talk a little bit about the National Register, which is the federal standard for listing historic properties that meet certain characteristics, and we'll talk some more about some of those characteristics perhaps as we get through the evening. I'm going to talk about a document we refer to as a DOE, which is a determination of eligibility. There are two sort of ways of assessing projects for eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places. One is a National Register nomination form, and the other is a determination of eligibility form, which goes through basically the same steps, but does it for projects that have what's referred to as a review and compliance or Section 106 process attached to them. Section 106 refers to a particular part of the National Historic Preservation Act, which says that federal undertakings have to have a certain set of parameters they have to meet, and mitigation if those parameters can't be met. In this case, there is Maryland state funding involved in portions of this project, so it is subject to a Section 106 process that is run by the state for state monies. And so those are sort of some basic terms, and I'll get to some other things as I get to them, but I'm going to be using those things pretty consistently through this presentation because everything that we're doing is because of some of those processes. So this particular image is a site aerial from the Maryland State GIS mapping program. And the rail terminal building is here on the corner of Patrick Street and Carroll Street. And the building that remains of the Birely Tannery is here. The red outlines that you see on this particular image are outlines that define properties that have Maryland inventory forms filed with MHT. And you'll notice that the property that's missing a boundary is the piece of the Tannery property that remains there. So when the development team approached the state of Maryland's at MHT, approached their review and compliance folks to find out what we needed to do, the first thing they said was, we don't know anything about that building because we don't even have a Maryland inventory form, so you'll have to do a determination of eligibility form before we can start anything. So that's where we started. So,
Can I make a quick point for that?
yep.
And again, I'm the archaeologist. In 1979, 1984, 1990, 1991, we had the different archaeological surveys. And usually, when those take place, you also record the structures on the sites. None of those points filled out a form for the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties. Either they were not compelled to do so, or their opinion of the property that it didn't need it. So just kind of bear that in mind, that once we started this property, there had been opportunities in the past, especially with the formation of the historic district, for that structure to be recorded, and it had never taken place until now.
Exactly. So, yeah, so that speaks to some level of understanding of the property in the past, okay? So we've embarked on this research effort to be able to compile a determination of eligibility form, particularly for the Tannery site. Not that we're doing this work to ignore the railway terminal or trolley building, but the DOE is what's being required by the Maryland Historical Trust, particularly for the remaining Tannery structure. So we've visited a number of local library resources, particularly helpful, the Maryland Room at the Seabar Arts Library, the library at the Frederick County Historical Society. We've been down to the Maryland Historical Trust. Michelle has pulled all the prior archaeology reports. We've gone through those together. We've consulted city directories. We've consulted historic logs and journals and published histories of the city of Frederick. So going on to the next piece. So one of the things that we needed to do for the eligibility form was to understand sort of what was typical of a tannery of the period. And so what we defined from the research was this set of elements of land use for typical tanneries in the late 18th and into the 19th century. So they typically used the entire parcel of land that they had. They relied on a consistent, convenient water source, which in this case was Carroll Creek. They needed a ready supply of bark. There was lots of oak forest around the Frederick area, so that was easy to come by. Oak was a preferred bark for tanning. A means of crushing or grinding the bark, so most tanneries had some kind of a bark mill. They needed a set of vats, sometimes above ground, sometimes below ground, sometimes a combination of the two. For putting the tanning baths in, they needed lime, which was locally available, the lime was typically stored in a separate shed on the property. They needed a beam house of some sort. Most tanneries started out with some kind of an open shed. Eventually, some of them closed in part of that or maintained both an open and a closed shed for beaming because it wasn't necessarily a pleasant smelling process. And the drying racks in the yard were typical, and sometimes some kind of a drying loft that was enclosed for inclement weather. So this particular tannery yard in the late 1800s looked like this photograph. And here you can see the sort of typical land use of a tannery. The use of the whole site, the drying racks in the yard, the creek in the foreground of the photograph, and a number of buildings and structures that contained all of those kinds of functions. This is a photograph of one of the bark sheds. The bark mill was alternately located on this site in one of the shed buildings that you saw in the prior photograph, the long line of buildings up along the property line, and then later in the footprint of where the remaining structure is now. The vats, it looks like from some of the maps I'll refer to, there's a particular kind of insurance company map called a Sanborn, and we'll all probably talk about it. I know Michelle will talk about them. This is a remarkably good record. These historic insurance maps are a remarkably good record of historic uses of properties and buildings because they told us a lot about what the structure was like, how many windows were in them, how thick the walls were around them, what kinds of materials they had, and often the purposes and uses inside the structures. So we can track sort of like where that bark mill moved around during the history of the tannery. We can track that by way of the Sanborn maps. So via the Sanborn maps, we know that early on this tannery had some above ground vats, and over time they were moved into underground vats that were located between the sets of buildings. And the vats were used, these gentlemen are probably loading one of the vats. So they would layer the hides with bark, which you can see piles of in the background there, and then put water over them to soak. And here's a gentleman in the beaming house scraping hides. The beaming operation was where the hair and remaining flesh on the hides was removed after between various soaking baths, typically in lime. So some of the earlier maps that were actually included in some of the earlier archaeology reports show this property prior to the Sanborns that we have. And this 1872 map, you see a purple outline. I forget that I have this thing in my hand. So there's a purple outline around there, and then there's a red outline here. That purple outline is sort of the group of properties that eventually belonged to the Birely family. That red outline is where the initial tannery piece was on the property. The next image, again, the purple line gives you the parameter of our site as what's left. This shaded area, by the way, is the area that was part of the study in the prior archaeological studies before the creek project was done. The red outline in this particular image is a portion of a building that was present on that site at that time, which is in the footprint area of the remaining building that's on the site now. Same set of parameters over here in this 1873 map. You can see the tannery's growing. There's some more structures here. The purple outline is the property, and again, the red outline is a piece of building that was present at that time, which is within the footprint of what is there today. So here's the Sanborn maps, and I've selected 3 out of about, what do we have, Michelle, like 12? So I've selected 3 that sort of reflect an early period, a middle period, and the later period of the maps that show the tannery going from a modest size, growing into this 1904 map is one of 2 that are around this time frame that show the tannery operation at its largest. And then the 1947 map, you can see how the buildings and structures downsize as the tanning operations tapered off and it became more of a warehousing and sales operation. So again, we've outlined in red on here, this piece is within the footprint of what's there today. This piece and that piece, again, within the footprint of what's there today. Now, this 1904 map is just before there was a particularly disastrous fire on the property in 1909, which was pretty close to a total loss. And so we'll show you some. So here's that late 1800s photograph again. And here's a photograph of a similar view after that 1909 fire. So you can see that a large amount of the tannery buildings and the roof and the top of this structure is gone. These structures over in here, this is that log building, which is right here. So you see the roof is burned out here, and then this whole section is gone. This was a big bark shed over here. And again, we're looking at various portions of the tannery complex after that fire. Can you go back one, Jim? This one shows sort of this corner of that building. And you can see in these images that this structure was built of stone. And it appears that this structure was built out of frame at that time. And so now we can go, can we go 2? So we did a little bit of diagrammatic analysis here from those Sanborn maps and the fire pictures. And so this is sort of an extent, just sort of giving you an idea of the basic mass of the structure before that 1909 fire, and then after the 1909 fire. And this section that's indicated in blue was rebuilt. The whole tannery was rebuilt, but this whole section was pretty much lost and is almost entirely new after the 1909 fire. And what's left today, as opposed to what was there before the 1909 fire, is a pretty substantial loss of the total fabric of the tannery operation. So let's talk a little bit about that relationship to the creek. So the creek was an essential water source for the tannery operation. They needed to have fresh water readily available to flush through the vats, to fill the vats for the soaks. And then the yard itself was this large area that sloped gently down to the creek. And since the flood control and the park were built, what's there now, the edge of this building is 10 feet from a retaining wall, which is about 6 feet high, and then a hill goes up from there. So the level of the walkway in the park is, I'm not exactly sure because I don't have a topo in front of me, but somewhere between 10 and 12 feet above the ground floor of the remaining tannery structure. And that embankment is planted in trees, so you can't see up there from the tannery, and in most of the length of that park, you can't see the tannery from up on the park.
Yeah, approximately 100 feet of the parcel is now taken up by the channelization of the creek. So 100 feet is gone.
And so these photographs show the experience of the creek, or lack thereof, from on the site. So you can see how tight this sort of relationship between the end of the building here and the retaining wall is. And you know, when you're looking down into the site, this is taken from up alongside the rail terminal building, and you just see the trees here, and you don't see anything. There's no way to experience that creek. There's no sound. There's no visual. And so this is taken from up on the linear park, and when you walk past where the tannery is and look back, then you can see the building. If this picture were taken up in here, you can't see the tannery at all from up there, directly behind it. Inside the building currently, from the second floor, we were able to photograph these burnt out conditions where the apartments had been in the later occupancy by the poultry company. There were apartments in the southern end and upper level. It's pretty unsafe in there. We didn't go any further than where these pictures were taken. None of us were going down those stairs. So nobody's been on that south side in the lower floor because we just can't get there. And then on the first floor, everything on the interior was converted for the poultry processing operation. So tile walls, a lot of graffiti, some evidence that some folks have been living in there periodically. And I did leave out some of the graffiti because it wasn't appropriate for a public forum. And so this is also one of the bark sheds. We believe this might be the one that was alongside the rail yard. What's interesting is that 1909 fire started actually in a hay car on a train parked on the rail yard. It started there, it spread into some of the rail structures, and then into the bark shed that was closest to the rail yard on that side, and then on into the rest of the tannery. So when they rebuilt, they didn't rebuild a bark shed on that side of the property. And I'm going to let Michelle talk about her work.
Yes, thank you. Hopefully it won't come falling off. Okay, as I mentioned, the previous archaeology, there was a phase 1 in 79, a phase 1, phase 2 in 84, and then the phase 3 in 91. And just let me explain what those different phases mean. As Mimi mentioned, all of this work is regulated by Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Okay, there are boxes that have to be checked, things that have to be followed. And so phase 1 for an archaeology project is presence or absence. You do testing, you accumulate artifacts if they're present, you count them, and you do distribution maps to try to figure out where a site may be located on a property. When it comes to urban archaeology, you usually have the benefit of maps and things of that nature. So phase 1 for this particular purpose was, again, checking the box because they knew a site was there because of the occupation of the property over 150 years. Phase 2 is very important for the information that we're gathering now for the determination of eligibility. Phase 2 is to gain and gather enough data, historic research, and materials from field work, from excavations, to determine if the property is eligible for the National Register. Okay? So what usually happens if there's a Phase 2 and the property has been determined eligible for the National Register, then it is somehow protected. Or the work that was planned is there's some kind of mitigation that takes place. A good example would be for highway archaeology, for state highways. One of the reasons they do Phase 3, which is data recovery more than anything else, is because the road is going through. So when the project is going to go forward and the site cannot be preserved, that is when you do Phase 3. And Phase 3 is the kind of archaeology that everybody thinks of, when you have these huge open blocks and you're excavating the entire site and you're gathering all the data that is available there. Subsequently, while you're gathering that data, you are destroying the site. The site is being excavated and it's gone and it's destroyed. That's why it's called data recovery. So what has happened to date is Phase 1, presence or absence. Is there a site there? Yes. And all of the background research that goes to support the information on that site. Phase 2, is there enough data? Is there enough historic research and records to determine that it's eligible for the National Register? They determined that in the 80s, that it was eligible. So when it came time to do the Carroll Creek channelization, they had to do a Phase 3 because it was going to be destroyed. Okay, the site that was determined eligible for the National Register was going to be destroyed by the undertaking of the channelization. Okay, so that is why they were compelled to do the Phase 3 archaeology survey. Okay. At the bottom there, it says no shovel test pits. Shovel test pits are what we use in Phase 1 and in Phase 2 to determine concentration of artifacts or to determine the location or presence or absence of foundation elements of buildings. Okay? No shovel test pits were done in the part of the property that we're talking about now because it was outside the level of disturbance. Okay? For cultural resource management, for Section 106, you are only required to test the areas that are going to be disturbed. Okay? It's not research archaeology, it's not academic archaeology, it's cultural resource management. Somebody is paying for it, therefore they're not required to test outside limits of disturbance. So that's why these sections have not been tested previously. Okay? And it was one of the questions I'd heard a bunch of times. So I hope that makes sense, okay? Why it wasn't done previously. Next slide, please. So you've seen some of these before, and I have a few more for you to show. But when it comes to the tannery over time, Mimi, of course, has covered that. Actually, we can have the next one. We'll just kind of cut to the chase. So when it comes to the Phase 3, I know you gave me the pointer. Where did I put it? There it is. Okay. So I mentioned how 100 feet of the property is gone because of the channelization. Okay. So this red line here basically represents the stone wall that's there now. Okay. So this is where the excavations took place previously. This is number 7 is the building. This says concrete patio. That's the foundation of a structure that's no longer standing, part of an addition to the building. Okay, so right here is the structure, and this is that 6 or 10 feet that is now between the retaining wall and the existing remains of the structure. Okay, so this is the Phase 3 archaeology that was done. When we do archaeology on this scale, we either use the National Park Service a standard, which is a 5 by 5 foot test unit. Or sometimes they use 1 meter, 1 meter square. Okay, so the whole thing is divided up. This is all for convenience. You need to know where things are coming from horizontally and vertically. Okay, so this is what was found. The dark outline is the stone foundation of the structures that Mimi has talked about before. All of these little rectangular areas, these are vats. That would have contained solutions of water and lime and the tannins from the oak bark that were used to process the tides, and an access cobblestone road and some pipes to move water around the site. Okay, so, bless you. So this is, again, no testing has been done on this side of the property. And this was done to the phase 3 level, where you're excavating it while subsequently destroying it because the project is going through. Okay, so, and now all of this is gone. The phase 3 report, when it comes to this level of reporting, this is the highest level of reporting. It contains the most data. It has an inventory of all of the artifacts that were found. It has soil analysis to what was found in the soil. Everything down to the seeds. They apparently liked peaches on this site because there's hundreds of peach pits. To the type of nuts that would have come in with the trees and the barks. So everything is tested. Faunal remains, animal bones. They did not only have apparently cow hides, but goat as well. So, I mean, this is a complete, full analysis of all of the data, thus data recovery, that was taken from this site. So this is very well documented indeed. Okay, next. Okay, so this is, again, the same thing that Mimi mentioned. This is from, it's called Maryland Merlin. It's Maryland's GIS system. The green outline indicates the current tax property. As far as the state of Maryland is concerned, that is the boundary of the property. This is what's left. Basically, it's a square, call it 230 by 175, and this represents the wall. Okay, so again, 100 feet of it is gone. Next slide, please. Okay, the Sanborn maps. These are spectacular for history geeks such as myself because they provide a tremendous amount of information. If you're not familiar with Sanborn maps, just to kind of give you some context, the purpose of them was to record what was on the property for insurance purposes. Okay, so it records everything from what was stored on the property. If it was a school, where the fuel tanks were for the furnaces. If it was a factory, where they kept their coal shed, where their boilers were. Okay? If it was a house, what it was made out of. Was it 2 stories? Was it 3 stories? Was it brick? Was it framed? Did it have a basement? Did it have an outhouse out back? They're very, very detailed. They come with incredible keys. They're very hard to read. I've been going blind for years trying to read these. But all the information is there. So we have had, we're very lucky. We have these covering the period from 1887 to 1971. Okay? And it was in the insurance company's interest to know what was on the property because they're insuring it. And also cities use them to help for everything from fire responses, because you need to know what's on the property, what you're going to face. So kind of keep that level of detail in mind. That was the purpose of the Sanborn map, to record the use and what was actually on the property. Okay? So the red line is basically the project area. Of course, there's a little bit of distortion when it comes to taking things back into history from photocopies. So, but basically the red line is where we're going to be testing. This is parking lot, this little rectangle. Can you go back just one for a second? Just so I'm not, this is not part of the property. This is a parking lot owned by this building. So these 2 skinny roadways are not going to be tested. They've been driveways since time immemorial. So basically you're going to be testing this area here. Go back, please. Okay, thank you. So as Mimi has covered in great detail, it shows all the different structures, and the different symbols on the structures tell you what they are. Anything with this X on it usually indicates that it's a barn, it's a livery building of some kind, okay? And they're labeled. They say things like lime storage, coal storage, bark barn. Again, we have great information on all these different things. There's one that says office. I'm assuming it apparently had stone foundation. It was likely frame that you think, people coming to look for a job, that's where they would go, talk to the foreman, where people get paid. It's a very kind of small building, but it was separate from the rest of the processing areas. Okay? So when it comes to the testing that we're going to undertake in the next week or so, we're doing what's called a phase 1/phase 2. The phase 1, we know there's a site there. So there's no reason to do a phase 1, do the reporting, and come back and do a phase 2. We're going to do it all at once. So phase 1 is traditionally shovel test pits. I dig a hole, it's got to be as wide, it's got to be 32 centimeters wide or as wide as a shovel, and it's got to go to subsoil. Okay? And we dig them systematically across the property at a set interval, okay, so that we're going to have complete coverage. Right? Phase 2 involves putting in test units. So wherever, say I hit the foundation of this building, or the edge of one of the vats, then we will put in a test unit, one of these 1 by 1 meter squares, get a look at the stratigraphy, get a look at the feature, remove the artifacts, etc. We remove artifacts for shovel testing as well. So if you're going to come by and visit me, don't expect to see like a huge block excavation, because that's not what's going on at this phase. This is the initial phases. We have to follow the steps prescribed by the state and federal programs. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is right at the turn of the century, and Mimi has mentioned how over time and investments, we know George Birely, after the Civil War, put a tremendous amount of money back into the tannery and improving it, making the storage for bark. At one point, they could store, according to the different records, over 500 tons of bark on the property for the processing of the hides. Next slide, please. Okay. This is in 22. This is after the fire. So it seems like it's kind of consolidated the practice. We also have the introduction of the rail lines and the dramatic change in grade. If you know anything about railways and construction, the first thing they do is they come and fill it in and make it flat. So if you're standing in the tannery, you're looking up at this property here, and the records indicate that wall, that retaining wall, was built at near the turn of the century. Okay, so we have again, this red is just to indicate where we're going to be testing and what we are likely going to encounter. So the foundation, this says bark shed. There are different rooms for the beaming process, the cutting. And it says, what's going on in the first story, what's going on in the second story, so we know what rooms were used for different things. This is no longer existent, and there was another addition at one point too, so that we may encounter the remains of those structures. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the other things I wanted to talk about are soils. There have been statements made about the soils and what people have heard could be in them. And I can happily answer questions regarding that. But one of the important things about where we are to this point, there has been a full environmental study of this property with soil samples taken and tested. Okay? We also know what they were doing and what they were using to process these hides at the tannery. Because of the level of technology and the things they advertised, they sold oak tanned leather, and they were very proud of it, and it was the product they were known for. Okay? So I'd be happy to address questions about soil and what may or may not be in it and what color it may or may not be. But I have done a full amount of documentation. This is from, I'm sorry for the quality of it. I didn't realize it was going to look like this blown up. This is from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Part of the U.S. Geological Survey, they come up with these soil maps. And the part of the tannery that's gone, okay, which is this area here, this 100 feet of property that is now under the channelization, is a kind of deposit that is associated with creeks and rivers, known as alluvial deposits. Every time it floods, it takes the surrounding soil, sands. In Maryland, in this part of Maryland, we have the Frederick bluestone. Okay? And so the sand and the sediment in this area is kind of a grayish blue. So just rest assured, we've been looking into that as well. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm going to hand things over here to Don, but I just wanted to make a point about the Sanborn maps. and the conditions on the property. None of the Sanborn maps indicate any chemical storage on the property all the way through to 1971. And again, the environmental testing that has been done also do not indicate the presence of any kind of dangerous substances. So I wanted to kind of address that fallacy and hopefully move on from it. I'll turn things over to Dawn.
I was going to ask Kara not to pass out the test yet. Let me finish what we have to do. Then we'll have our quiz, make sure you all have been paying attention. What I want to do is spend a few more minutes talking to you about the railway terminal building, which is, I guess, the third part of what we wanted to present to you all tonight. The Frederick and Middletown Railroad was incorporated in 1894, and it was opened initially as service to the new resort at Braddock Heights and Middletown in the summer of 1896. It was interesting to know that because most of these growing rail lines were electrified, that the owners also acquired electric power companies that were in the area. In the early 1920s, this particular group reorganized under the name Potomac Edison because it was getting almost 70% of its income from electric utilities. Its final run was as a rail line was in 1954. It did serve to connect rural communities, social, recreational, business purposes. In the early 20th century, it grew with connections to the B&O Railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, Western Maryland Railroads, and provided then freight service as well as passenger traffic into the Frederick area. This building replaced earlier buildings, but dates back to about 1910. And you can see the wonderful photograph of the trolley. This side was the freight side. You'll see in slides you saw a minute ago with the rail lines that ran along the side of the building. This side was the passenger side. And they were able to, if you've been in the building, this area is low enough still that there's a platform that you could enter the rail line from there, the rail car from there. Next. The original building, the front building is 2 stories. You'll see that certainly today. But the back building substantially was 1 story. It was a freight terminal. And you can see today even the appearance of these various door openings that were there as a rail opening. Okay. If you look at that building now, it's had a 2nd floor, same view. The 2nd floor was added on at various changes to that building that occurred in the 1920s and 1930s subsequently. The building was sold to the Frederick News Post in 1966, and they added, let me take another view. This is where the passenger area was on the 1st floor of the building. You can see in a current photograph where that rail car had gone into the building. That's been obviously modified and enclosed. One of our goals would be in preserving this building is to somehow reconfigure that entrance to appear more like it did originally. Whether we can stick a rail car in there or not, I'm not sure. You can also see that the corner of that building, these steps have been truncated. They originally stepped out further into the sidewalk under the current street configuration. That sidewalk is too narrow to have done that. So they have modified that. Interior, on the 2nd floor, there's the remnants of an office space that's there. There's a vault that is there that was used during the time of the rail terminal, and would hope that those could be preserved. Now, let me just be careful and clear about part of this. The 1st floor of the building, which you've seen, is that 2-story portion. The back was the original 1-story that had a 2nd floor added. And then subsequently, in the 60s, a press room was added to the rear. During this process, we would suggest that the most contemporary addition to this building is not historic and non-contributing. The second floor, you saw the pictures where the vault is and that small little office in the corner, and then the second floor of the more historic building, the 1920s building generally, occurs here, and those should be saved. I think and then here again is a wonderful photograph of what you saw in the Sanborn map. Here the rail yard that runs along the side of the building, and here's the tannery sitting down over here. So this shows the sort of side of this building when it was only one story. So this is an old photograph back in maybe 1910 or 1915 before that addition was added. The building, this particular building, has been specifically indicated as a contributing building to the Frederick National Register Historic District, which was extended to include these areas in 1982. We certainly do agree with that determination, and that there's enough of the existing building to appropriately signify the history and importance of this building over the years to the city, and have recommended clearly to the development team from the outset that the exterior be fully restored, and that key elements of the interior be incorporated into the reuse of the building. What I want to do is wrap up now. We certainly welcome your questions, but part of what we've shared with you tonight is sort of this ongoing information. Understand, as we do and have from the beginning, that this is a process. It's an ongoing effort. We are balancing, as everybody should understand, a great deal of information that is required by the state of Maryland associated with their funding for their determination of eligibility and the Section 106, all that you've heard, the archaeological work that we're doing. We also are working with and need to appropriately work with the local Historic Preservation Commission. Each of those have the opportunity under their regulations to make independent decisions, and so we've been very careful to try to keep information public and detailed as we go along. It's our expectation as we sort of balance through this process, public process too, that we will find common ground between all parties. We think our research has been very detailed, we think very defendable in all respects, but we do understand that there are different issues and different audiences as we go through this process. But understand that it is a process and that we're trying to work through it as carefully as we can. So we thank you for your time and your interest, and we welcome any questions.